the Arista Texas org, and we'll post the email link up here. Most people should already know. My name is Brian King. I'm the Vice President of Arista Texas. We actually have Sumant on the phone. Sumant, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, my name is Sumant Malavaram. I'm the immediate past president and a board member.
Okay. And Oli, if you're unmuted. Maybe she's not back, so.
I think Patrick is online too.
Okay. Patrick, you want to unmute and...
Sorry, I was here. I just hit the wrong button.
Yeah.
I'm Ollie Powers. I'm currently the Secretary of Arista Texas.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
This is Patrick Young, and I'm on the board of Arista, and I'm with AECOM in Dallas.
Okay. See anybody else, guys? Okay, well, we can introduce later. So, well, we're about 2 after right now, so let's we'll go ahead and get started in about 1 minute. And we are going to be recording this, so please use the group chat window to ask any questions for later. We can unmute you as we're recording this, so the verbal interaction with Nate would be great for the recording, and could be very beneficial for other people in academia or just in the workforce to use this recording down the road. So by all means, raise your hand, and we can let you speak, and Nate can answer questions after this. So, well, we're up to 53 people. Oli, you think we're good to get rolling?
Yeah, we can probably start soon. Again, if for those who are just coming in, if you could change your participant name to your first and last name, so we are sure to give you credit for today's webinar.
Okay. All right, Sumant, if you could hit the record button and let me know that we're good.
Yep, we're good.
All righty. I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. This is the June 2017 Arista Texas Virtual Speaker Series. Today we have a fantastic speaker, Nate Harold, is a physical scientist with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, OCM, and is located out of Charleston, South Carolina. Nate is the manager for the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer and the land use GIS data, and he'll elaborate more on that here shortly. But the topic of the presentation is modeling potential wetland impacts due to sea level rise and NOAA's Sea Level Rise Viewer. So at any rate, I'm going to go ahead and kind of turn this over to Nate, and really appreciate you helping us out and presenting, and look forward to a great presentation. So we're turning it over to you, Nate.
Sure, thanks, Brian. Appreciate the intro, and for you all inviting me to come and chat with you a little bit today. I'm going to try to keep it somewhat informal in terms of the presentation. I'm not speaking to PowerPoint slides, which I'm hoping will go well. I'm going to try to speak to some of our websites and the tool as part of a live demo instead, and bring up what we need. Did a kind of a similar presentation to at least a few of you that are probably on the call here today a few weeks back, and that seemed to work out pretty well. So as Brian said, I'm with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, and what we're going to talk about today is some of the work that we do as part of our Sea Level Rise Viewer. I thought that maybe the best way to get started in this is give you just a little bit of an overview on NOAA's digital coast efforts a little bit. This is the make that tool available. So the screen that you're seeing right now is the home page of our Digital Coast website. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the website in general, but it is a great resource for coastally focused data, tools, training, and information or example on how some of those data tools and training can be used in coastal areas. On the front page here, you can see the Sea Level Rise Viewer is one of our most popular tools. It's actually ranked #1. You can certainly get to it that way, or you can find it within the tools section of the site, or you can search within the site and it'll come up, as well as just typing it right into Google. It tends to come up there right as the first response. So I'm going to kind of give you an overview of the web page that we have here in the Digital Coast in support of the tool first. Obviously, this page gives you a little bit of information about the tool and what the tool does. I'm going to go into a lot of that as I get into the demo itself. But I did want to point out that some of the things I will bring up and some of the information you might be most interested in is available down within this additional information section, where we have things like our frequently asked questions, many of the technical documents that describe the mapping methodologies that are done in different portions of the tool. You'll see those different portions as we get into the demo. Information about when and where what data is being updated. And this would be of particular importance if you're looking for areas that may have been lacking in terms of elevation data previously, or in which areas are getting the most up-to-date data processed for them. We also have some acknowledgments about some of the partners that have been involved in our efforts in the past, and some story maps and other publications that would be of particular interest to folks. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the tool here. Pretty much a standard disclaimer page that lets you get in here, but it also gives you a little bit of an overview of the different portions of the tool, which we'll see here in a second. So you click the Get Started button, and you're launched off into the tool. And I'll just note for those of you who I did speak with a couple of weeks back, we had 2 versions of the tool at the time. This is our new version. It's replaced the older version. This was a beta at that point. So for those of you who may be familiar with the tool but haven't quite seen this new updated look and feel, I'll note that it's pretty much the same tool with a revamped look and feel to it, as well as some additional bells and whistles that we'll get to in a few seconds. So this is the tool. As I mentioned earlier, and a couple of times now, there are several different tabs within the tool. You can see those here down the left-hand side. And I'll go through those in order, but first let me zoom in here to an area around Freeport. So the layer and the tab that the tool starts you off with is what we call our sea level rise tab. This is essentially a mean high water surface. And as you can see, if you look at the slider bar that we have available over here on the left-hand side, essentially what you're looking at is a current mean high water surface. And essentially the way that the tool functions is you can slide this slider up by 1 foot increments, and you can see that as you do that, the area that's inundated under that mean high water line increases. And right now the tool goes up to 6 feet. Several of the other portions of the tool kind of focus in around this inundation surface. So there's this surface here, and I should mention one of the things that we do is make some visualizations, not just on the map, but in some photo. So here we have some, locally familiar locations, and as you move this slider up and down, not only does the water surface in the map increase, but you'll start to see a water surface be inserted into that photo so that folks can kind of get a feel for what conditions on the ground might look like in those different locations. And again, you can kind of see how the water surface starts to rise up the side of that pier there. So one other layer that we have within the tool is the mapping confidence layer. And hopefully it'll draw here in a second. There we go. So this layer here shows what level of confidence that we have that we are mapping where that mean high water line would be. This is shown in a 2-color graphic. Essentially, areas in blue are denoted as areas where we have a high confidence that they fall under that mean high water line. And areas of orange where we aren't quite as sure. And this includes both areas that fall under what we map as the mean high or high water surface, and some areas that are just above that surface. And the way that we calculate this confidence layer is based on the error that's involved in the LiDAR data that we develop all of our DEMs from, as well as the error that's inherent in the V-datum transformations that we use to convert those LiDAR elevation surfaces into tidal elevation surfaces. And so you can see here, as you slide the amount of sea level rise up, you can see how some of that confidence and uncertain areas kind of change. And as you may expect, or maybe as it would make sense to you, the lower, flatter areas tend to have the least confidence, because small changes in elevation can make a very large geographical difference. And the errors involved in those elevation data sets can extrapolate out over those larger geographies. And as you move up and start getting into steeper topography, those uncertain areas become quite smaller, just because you're dealing with a less horizontal area that covers the same vertical amount of elevation. A few of the other tabs that we include in the tool, one of these is called the vulnerability tab. Essentially, this is a tab that highlights social vulnerability. It's built off of a social vulnerability index. And essentially what it shows is areas where the population is more susceptible or more vulnerable. And what you can do is compare that to the areas of inundation, so that you can kind of understand not only what areas are going to be inundated, but where those areas impact your most vulnerable populations. And a final tab that I'll mention before we move on to the actual Marsh information is one that deals with flood frequency. And so this is a tab that it doesn't have a slider. You may have noticed that disappeared as we went here. But essentially what the areas in red here are highlighting is areas of shallow coastal flooding, or what's sometimes referred to as nuisance flooding. So you can see both the extent of those areas, as well as bring up some of the tide gauges where that information exists, and you can see how current condition, a 1.6 foot sea level rise and a 3.2 foot amount of sea level rise, how that would change both the number and the frequency of those shallow coastal flooding events. And so what you see is as sea level rise increases to a certain extent, you see a much larger number of those flooding events. And as sea level rise continues beyond that to a much greater extent, you start seeing even more events. And eventually what we see in many locations is that the events start to drop after some point, and the duration starts to increase. So instead of getting more shorter events, you end up getting so many shorter events that they kind of drag out into one another and combine to form one longer duration event. So you get a fewer number of flooding events, but more flooding over a longer period of time. So with that, I'll kind of switch over into the Marsh tab. This is a tab that I guess I should give a little bit of background first before I do that switch. So we've done this kind of inundation mapping now for quite a while within OCM, and it serves a lot of great purposes. But one thing that we found in interacting with our constituents is that not everyone always really kind of comprehended what a mean high or high water surface meant in relation to wetlands, or what it would mean in a future sea level scenario to future wetlands. What we ended up kind of learning from interacting with people was that they saw this new mean high or high water line and kind of walked away with the incorrect perception that all of the wetlands that exist in these areas are going to be wiped out due to that future amount of sea level rise. And we know that that's not necessarily the case. Many wetlands have quite a capacity to keep up with at least a moderate level of sea level rise. So what we decided that we needed to do was to do a little bit of work to add on top of that and actually explore for folks what those impacts to potential future wetlands might be, and be able to show to those users areas that are more likely to keep up with certain amounts of sea level rise, which areas might be lost, and most importantly to some folks, the areas where wetlands might migrate into in the future. And so we started off by kind of looking through some of the existing tools that were out there. Several of you may be familiar with a tool called SLAM, the Sea Levels Affecting Marshes model. We started with that tool initially, and there were some things that we really liked about the tool. It does have quite a few bells and whistles that you can account for erosion and accretion and the water table, but it requires a lot of extra information that either we or some of our partners didn't always have. And it required you to kind of break a large area up into a number of smaller areas so that the tool would be able to process them in a reasonable amount of time. And there were some things about the tool that we didn't like. Some of the things that it accounts for in terms of the variables that it includes can be somewhat simplistic in terms of the modeling that it does. For instance, it takes into account erosion, and one of the major drivers for where it applies where erosion will or won't occur is the direction to the ocean. And what you end up seeing is that erosion is strongly driven away from the direction that's defined as the ocean, and that erosion in all the other three cardinal directions is really not accounted for. And in addition, it doesn't really account very well when your direction from the ocean isn't in one of the four cardinal directions. So in this case, we're looking at a southeast kind of direction. You'd have to pick either south or east as your direction, and that therefore accounts for only a portion of that. So what we really decided to do was take kind of the core rule set that existed behind SLAM, and I'm going to pull over this graphic here just to kind of explain what it is that we do in the modeling. In the inundation modeling that we talked about in the previous tab, we really focused in on that mean high or high water surface. In the wetland modeling that we do, we actually create four surfaces. We create them same mean or high water. Then we go and create a mean high water surface. Then we create a mean tide level and a mean low water. Actually, I should have said that it's a mean higher spring. So essentially we create one tidal layer that's above the mean high water and two that are below. Instead of treating the modeling that we do like a bathtub where the water level raises up and down based on the amount of inundation that you're interested in, we treat it more like a 7-layer dip where all of these layers kind of move up and down, and that helps define where each of the wetlands that we're mapping exist. And so what you see here is kind of the relationship that we've defined, and that these were derived from kind of the very basic of what SLAM does, is that below a mean low water is water, between it and a mean tide level is an unconsolidated shore category, which would be your sandy intertidal areas and mudflats. Above the mean tide and below the mean high is our salt marsh. Our above the mean high and below the mean higher spring level is kind of the brackish or transitional marsh area. And then above that and up to what we said is kind of a wetland majority threshold is where we kind of extrapolate out where freshwater wetlands will be. And that's based on comparing existing elevation information to the existing distribution of our coastal change analysis program land cover data sets. And so what we've done is just defined an elevation at which a vast majority of wetlands exist below a certain elevation. In this case, we defined it as kind of 66%, and above which you start kind of dropping off of that vast majority into a lot more upland environments. So as I mentioned, we started off by creating a data set that would kind of do in a similar way as the inundation or the sea level rise tab, would start to look at what the potential impacts from wetlands might be. And so you can kind of slide the same viewer up and see how some of the wetland categories start to change in the modeling that we do. You can't actually see the whole legend all at once, but you can start to see that the magenta colors that we map are kind of our marsh environments. The cyan color that we map is our unconsolidated shore, and obviously the blue color is what we map as water. And so you can see as you start to progress across these thresholds, you start to see what is salt marshes start to progress into more unconsolidated shore. Now, one of the things that we had to do was account for more than just the inundation or the future sea level rise that would occur. And what we did was accounted for accretion rates. And so we actually have the ability to select one of 3 accretion rates and see how that changes some of these impacts. So there's 2 things that we can kind of look at in this tool, and the same holds true when you look in the local scenario part of the tool. There's really 2 ways to view what you're seeing in the viewer here. One is where you can look at viewing a scenario by the different years. And so in this case, you can select between some of the defined scenarios that exist in terms of an intermediate low, an intermediate high or high. And then once you have that kind of selected, you can take a look over on the left-hand side and see, based on that scenario, in 10-year or so increments, where each of the tidal surfaces would be. So if you're interested in this intermediate scenario, you can see that at 2020, you'll be at about 0.7 feet. At 2040, you'll be at 1.3 feet. At 2060, you'll be at 2.17 feet. And then you can move this slider along to get as close to those thresholds as you can. The other way you can look at it is by looking at being able to slide the years and then find the one individual scenario that you want. So in both instances, you need to have a kind of an idea of, in terms of combination of both year and scenario, what you're interested in seeing the potential impacts from. And so I'm going to jump back to our website real quick so that I can bring up kind of our mapping methods and essentially explain to you a little bit of what it is that we do and how it is that you can interact with these data sets. One of the things that we do, I mentioned, we try to take into account accretion. In the modeling that we do, we wanted to keep everything very consistent and very computationally efficient. So there's kind of 2 things that we do. We account for that basic rule set that I talked about a minute ago in terms of the tidal elevation thresholds for where certain wetland types exist. We also try to account for accretion rates. We do that in a flat manner across the entire area. We apply 1 accretion rate to all the wetlands. And we did it in that way because it was a lot more computationally efficient to do that, and very consistent. The other reason that we did it that way is that many of the folks that we interacted with didn't have very detailed accretion information to supply. They might have had 1 or 2 locations where they could supply that accretion information, but typically not a very spatially explicit surface or a very wide distribution of those locations so that you could start to extrapolate it out spatially. So this was a much more straightforward way to do it. And so what we end up doing is essentially running a model that takes those various elevation surfaces that we create and adds increments of sea level rise to them, or subtracts it, whichever way you want to think about that, so that we essentially spit out output layers for either quarter or half-foot increments of future sea level rise. So if you think about a 0 surface being the current condition, we essentially create modeled surfaces for what it would look like at a half-foot, 3/4 of a foot, a foot, at quarter-foot increments all the way up until you hit 2 feet, and then it's half-foot increments after that. And so what you end up needing to do then is based on what amount of sea level rise and what accretion rate you feel is appropriate for the areas that you're modeling, you kind of need to have a lookup table to go through and figure out those files. And so we have a lookup table that kind of explains how we do that in our documentation, which is what we're looking at right now. But the nice thing about our new sea level rise viewer is that the information that we were just looking at a minute ago kind of takes some of that into account for you. So you don't actually have to go through the process of that lookup like you used to in our older tool. So, you know, if you've decided that 2060 of an intermediate high scenario is what you're interested in, then you know that the net impact given a medium amount of accretion, which is what we define as 4 millimeters per year, would be about a 3-foot net impact to the surface of the marsh. And then what you can see is, you know, as you select a lower level of accretion, the impacts into the marsh start to become a little bit greater. And then you can kind of move this slider up to see what those net impacts then start to look like in those marsh areas. So I mentioned that we look at that rule set and where the tidal elevations would account for different wetland types to exist, and we account for accretion. The only other thing that we really account for in the tool is areas that are currently developed. We do not allow any kind of wetlands to migrate into those developed features. We don't show them as being inundated to any extent. We assume that those areas are in all intents and purposes protected, even though that we know many of the roads and developed features are not. We just wanted to make sure that we didn't model those areas as changing to wetlands. Plus, as you start to see more and more inundation crop up into some of these areas, it's good context to be able to find all the different features that it is that you're looking for. And that's kind of comparing or contrasting to what's available in some of the other modeling tools like SLAM that are out there, where you can take into account a larger number of other parameters like erosion. Now, within the tool, you can have several different options. There's always an information tab down here in the bottom that describes to you a little bit what you're seeing in the tool and some of the options that are available to you. There are options in the upper right portion of the map to change your base map, to change the opacity of the data so that you can see the imagery that lies underneath. You can check out the legend, which we've had up until this point. There's actually a link here so that you can share the location with others by using this URL. So if you copy and paste this URL into an email, you can send it to someone and they'll see the tool essentially in the exact same way that you were looking at it when you created that URL. If you were also interested, you could share these kind of screen grabs by Facebook or Twitter. I haven't heard a whole lot about people who do that. So if anyone does, please let me know. And there's also the ability to download the data. And I'll bring this up, but also mention that right now the data sets that are available are essentially all of the data sets in the tabs of the tool other than the wetlands tab. We're still working at getting that wetland information served up in this same tool. Currently, we have an FTP site where we make a lot of that information available. And if anyone's interested in accessing any of that information, they can contact me and I can point you directly to it, as well as provide a copy of that lookup table that you can use for determining which of those layers you might be most interested in downloading. And then I'll just finally kind of end with a couple of notes. One would be that while we create these marsh or wetland surfaces to highlight essentially a static condition at a future point in time, they can certainly be used in conjunction with one another so that you could start to look at and extrapolate out areas where wetlands migrate, areas where wetlands change but potentially aren't lost, areas where wetlands are lost, and kind of get derived information from those data sets. You can do that just by comparing those various output layers to one another. And then the other thing I want to note is that we are currently working over the next year to reprocess some of the wetland data that we have in the tool currently. A lot of the data was originally processed with 2006 as its starting point based on the land cover that we had available to us at the time. Since then, we have updated our land cover data to 2010, and we've started to include newer elevation surfaces. So we're essentially going back through over the next several months to a year and going to try to reprocess all of our wetland data to bring it all up to the same starting condition and to include the most recent elevation data sets that are available. And I'll note, excuse me, I'll note too, there are some certain geographies, and I'll go and click on one of them. I know Hawaii might not be the area where you all are interested, but the reason I go here is because we actually have some higher resolution data sets. The data that we were looking at previously is what we call our regional data. It's based on 30-meter pixels derived from Landsat imagery. Data such as this that you're seeing here is this data set's more of a 2-meter data set derived from a higher resolution image source. And you can just see some of the greater level of detail that exists in this data compared to some of the others. And the reason I mention that is over the next several years, we are trying to migrate the land cover mapping that we do from a 30-meter level to a 1-meter product line. We figure it's going to take us several years to do that, and very well may require some cost sharing on parts of folks that might be interested in that data, but it's something that potentially we could look forward to in the future. And I'd be real interested if folks thought that that would be a vast improvement in terms of some of the wetland modeling that could be done based on these data sets. And so with that, maybe I'll stop there and see whether folks had questions that they'd want to pose, or if there are things that maybe I have not covered that would be useful to cover.
All right. Well, this is Brian King, the moderator
have
here.
The 2 network licenses. So, and I guess Steve Rowe was telling me that his office was using it. And then
everybody unmuted right now.
Someone in Sparks was also using it. I can't think of the name right now. Yeah.
Oh. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think we unmuted everybody. So I think we're going to open it up for a question and answer here for Nate. And appreciate you taking the time and talking to us today. So we got a few questions in right now. I guess Kevin Glob, if you wanted to ask your question, we could unmute you, and or I can read it. Let's see, I don't know if you're on the phone. He was asking, what is the primary source of the elevation data used, or sources?
Yeah, so it's definitely sources. Essentially, we compile the best available data that we can. All of it is LiDAR-based elevation surfaces, but where or when the LiDAR data was flown varies to a pretty good extent. If you go to the download site where you can access that information, you can both download the information itself as well as the metadata that describes the various collects that would have been involved in each of those geographies, as well as some of the error estimates associated with that data. We do, I'll note, take a lot of those varying error estimates associated with each individual LiDAR collect or mission into account when we produce that confidence layer that I highlighted early on in the presentation.
Okay.
Other than that, for the wetlands piece, we combine the elevation information with the Coastal Change Analysis Program, CCAP, land cover that NOAA produces. And I maybe should have mentioned this up front. You know, I'm not necessarily an elevation expert. My main work within NOAA is actually in the land cover mapping side of this work. And essentially what I do then is take that elevation information and combine it with our land cover to produce some of these potential impact layers.
Okay, great. Next, we have a question here from Gordon Wells. Does the model used for the sea level rise viewer account for the dynamics of coastal erosion and sedimentation under changing physical thresholds caused by rising sea levels, or is it simply a passive bathtub inundation calculator? For instance, how does the model handle tipping point conditions that could destabilize the equilibrium state for barrier island formation?
Yeah, so it really doesn't consider that at all. We look at current mean high water areas and how those and the other surfaces and how those areas would look given current conditions into the future. So we do not account for sediment movement or erosion or where it would be lost or where it would be deposited. You know, that's a much more intense kind of modeling than what we can really do here. That being said, you know, the surfaces that we do create do at least kind of vary across geography. So you can see each of the kind of locations that are available here in these orange, blue, yellow areas, so that you can at least see how past and future scenarios would vary across there. But yeah, we do not account for sediment movement in any way.
Okay. If anybody has questions, please type them into the chat window, or if you have a mic, you can say unmute me, and we'll do it that way. Nate, I do have a question for you, and I know that you are in charge of the land use. So we're here in Texas, and you know, we have coastal on the Gulf Coast side. Do you all have a date in mind, or what is the plan for updating the Texas Gulf Coast land use data to hopefully the 1 meter?
Yeah, so we produce our data on a 5-year cycle. So our last cycle was 2010 or 2011, depending on where you were in the country. We are currently actively working on our 2015 and 2016 update cycle. There are certain areas of the country where we have already started to release that data. Up in the Great Lakes is one of those. We have not started the work in Texas yet. When we do, the way that we are planning to do it, and this would probably be an area that we would be considering making the contract awards for either next fiscal year or the following fiscal year, which I know is starting to get to a point where it's a bit stale in terms of the date. But the way that we would intend for that to work, and this kind of gets into probably a little bit more detail on some of the future of our higher resolution mapping efforts, is that we would actually be working through several phases. And I mentioned earlier that you know, that's a much more expensive proposition to us than some of the mapping that we've done at the 30 meter level. And the way that we're trying to go about doing that, because we can't afford to do it all at once, is through several different phases. The first phase will be a 1 meter product that we develop based on either the 2015 or 2016 NAEP. I can't remember off of the top of my head which year was flown in Texas, or if you know, Texas has a separate state collect that we'd consider using instead. And essentially what we would do is develop a 1 meter product that focused in on 6 categories. And so the categories would be impervious, bare, grass, shrub, forest, and water. Those products would actually be restricted in terms of the use that we can make of them initially. And the main reason behind that is the cost associated with the unrestricted version of those data. And then what we would end up doing with that data set is immediately rolling it up to a 30 meter and using that 30 meter version of that data to directly inform our 30 meter update to the existing CCAP data sets in order to keep our time series moving forward in a consistent manner. And then we'd start reaching out to folks who might have interest in the 1 meter product and seeing what we can do to talk about unrestricting the data set that we developed with those 6 categories and potentially adding in the various other categories that CCAP maps or that those partners would be interested in. Our long-term vision would be is that we would be able to do just that, unrestrict the data, add in our additional categories to bring it up to an 18 or 20 class 1 meter product. And then before we get to the 2020 or 2021 timeframe, have that all taken care of so that as we move into that next update cycle, we're actually updating those products at a 1 meter resolution.
Okay, great. Do you know if taking the phased approach, if it's going to be starting in the north and go south, or is there no idea at this point?
Within Texas, you mean?
Correct.
Yeah, no, I mean, we'd probably try to work on the whole coastal section of the state all at one time.
Okay. Was there any more questions? If you do think of questions after the presentation's over, feel free to email them to our email address, and we can get it posted up here, and we'll pass it on to Nate. And if you have any interest in talking with Nate, then I'm sure we can arrange that as well at some point. So, well, I don't see any more questions here. There's our email address, so please email us. If you don't receive your PDH for this, please let us know. I know some people have called in as well, and we've just asked for you to give us your first and last name here, so it makes it easier for us, but reach out to us if you haven't received that. So, well, Nate, we really appreciate you talking today, and thanks for sharing. Please let us know when you journey to Texas and for the land use data, and reach out, and we'd love to be a voice or talk to you about that when the time happens.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity, and hopefully folks found it useful. And if they do have any further questions or feedback or comments, that they should feel free to contact me and shoot them along.
Perfect. Okay, well, we are recording this. We're going to post it up to our website very soon. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Oli Powers, who's going to bring you up to date on the next speaker series for July.
Great, thanks, Brian. So our next speaker series is going to be Tuesday, July 25th, and we're pleased to have Meredith Gillum, who's going to be presenting her work preparing for the 2020 census, the local update of census addresses, LUCA. This is going to be particular interest to those in local and county government, and it's going to shed some insight into the challenges that is going into this process, and we hope that you guys can all make it. Great.
Okay, well, we're going to be done just a little bit early, and hope you all have a good rest of the day. And Nate, once again, appreciate it. And I guess that's pretty much it. We'll see you all in July, and that's it for this this presentation for June. Thank you all.
Thanks, Brian.